For our new listeners, Sleep Theories is where we explore the shadows between documented fact and terrifying possibility, where we examine the stories that powerful people would prefer remain buried. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleep Theories. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Your support means everything, and it allows us to keep digging into the stories that others are afraid to tell. My name is James Adler. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've made a living digging into the stories that powerful people prefer to keep buried. Cold War projects, classified experiments, the kind of truth that gets stamped with red ink and locked away in filing cabinets that officially don't exist. I've exposed illegal CIA surveillance programs, uncovered Pentagon black sites, and revealed government contracts with private military companies that operated outside the law. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered about Plum Island. For most people, Plum Island is just a dot off the coast of Long Island, a name on a map if they notice it at all. Just another small island in the Atlantic, unremarkable and forgotten, barely 3 miles long and less than a mile wide. Ask 100 people on the street about Plum Island, and maybe 2 or 3 will have heard of it. Those who have will probably tell you it's some kind of animal research facility, something to do with protecting livestock. They'd be right in a way, but they'd also be so wrong that their ignorance might be the only thing keeping them safe. You see, Plum Island became the beginning of a story that was never supposed to be told. A story that may have cost me everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between science and horror. A story that has made me question whether I'll live long enough to see it published. It started on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday in October 2023. I was working from my apartment in Brooklyn Heights, a cramped 2-bedroom that doubled as my office and archive. The walls were covered with bulletin boards connected by red string, the classic conspiracy theorist setup that had become my professional trademark. I was deep in research on a CIA mind control program from the 1970s called MKULTRA, following up on a lead about experiments conducted on unwitting subjects in Canadian psychiatric hospitals. The documents were spread across my desk, declassified memos, medical records, testimony from survivors who had spent decades trying to get someone to believe their stories. I'd been working for 6 hours straight, surviving on nothing but coffee and the kind of obsessive focus that comes from knowing you're close to exposing something important. That's when my doorman called up from the lobby. His name was Carlos, a 60-something Dominican man who had been working the building for over 20 years. He knew my routine, knew that I rarely received packages, and definitely knew that I was paranoid about unexpected deliveries. "Mr. Adler," he said, his accent thick with concern, "there's a package here for you. No delivery company, no return address. Just came by messenger, but the guy was gone before I could ask any questions." My blood went cold. In my line of work, mysterious packages are never a good sign. They're either from sources who can't risk being identified, or from people who want to silence you permanently. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference until it's too late. "What does it look like, Carlos?" "Manila envelope about this big," I could hear him gesturing over the phone. "Your name written in block letters, black marker. Feels like there's something small inside, maybe a USB drive or something." I told him I'd be right down. As I rode the elevator to the lobby, my mind raced through possibilities. Had one of my sources finally gotten access to something big? Was this related to the MKUltra story I'd been working on? Or was this something else entirely, something connected to one of the dozen other investigations I had running simultaneously? The envelope was exactly as Carlos had described it. My name, James Adler, written in careful block letters across the front. No return address, no postmark, no identifying marks of any kind. The paper felt expensive, heavier than standard office supply stock. When I held it up to the light, I could see the outline of what was definitely a flash drive inside. Back in my apartment, I stared at that envelope for almost an hour before opening it. Every instinct I had developed over 15 years of investigative journalism was screaming at me to be careful. Mysterious sources had contacted me before, but never like this. Usually there was some kind of preliminary communication, some way to establish trust and verify credentials. This felt different. This felt dangerous. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and the journalist in me couldn't resist. When I finally opened that envelope and pulled out the flash drive, I found myself holding a standard USB stick with a single piece of tape attached. On the tape, written in the same block letters as the envelope, was a single folder name: PIADCOBSCURA. PIADC. I recognised the acronym immediately: Plum Island Animal Disease Centre. But what was Obscura? A project code? A classification level? And why would someone want me to have files related to what was supposed to be a routine agricultural research facility? I should have been more careful. I should have scanned the drive on an isolated system, maybe contacted someone in cybersecurity to check for malware or tracking software. But the reporter in me was already hooked. I plugged that drive into my main computer without a second thought. What I found changed everything. The folder contained dozens of files: documents, videos, photographs, email exchanges, and correspondence spanning more than 50 years. As I began to examine them, I realised I was looking at the most comprehensive collection of classified materials I had ever encountered. These weren't the typical heavily redacted documents you get through Freedom of Information Act requests. These were complete files, unedited and uncensored, detailing activities that were never supposed to see the light of day. There were research reports describing experiments that violated every ethical standard in medicine and biology. There were photographs of creatures that shouldn't exist, beings that appeared to be part human and part something else. There were video files showing procedures that looked less like scientific research and more like medieval torture. As I worked through the night, reading file after file, I began to understand that I had stumbled onto something far bigger and more terrifying than any story I had ever investigated. This wasn't just another government cover-up or bureaucratic corruption. This was evidence of a program that had been running for decades, hidden behind the innocent facade of agricultural research, pushing the boundaries of science into territories that should never have been explored. By dawn, I knew three things with absolute certainty. First, the official story of Plum Island was a complete fabrication. Second, whatever had really been happening there represented one of the most significant violations of human rights and scientific ethics in American history. And third, someone had risked everything to get these files to me, which meant they believed I was the right person to expose the truth. What I didn't know yet was that investigating this story would put me in more danger than I had ever faced before, or that the conspiracy I was about to uncover reached into the highest levels of government and continued to this very day. The official story of Plum Island reads like a government press release, written by someone who had never been asked a difficult question in their life. According to the USDA's public information, the Plum Island Animal Disease Centre was established in 1954 as a response to the growing threat of foreign animal diseases to American agriculture. The facility was designed to study dangerous livestock diseases like foot and mouth disease in a contained environment, keeping potential biological threats safely isolated from the mainland. It was a noble mission, presented in the kind of sanitized language that government agencies use when they want to sound important but boring. The official literature described state-of-the-art laboratories, dedicated scientists working around the clock to protect America's food supply, and the highest standards of biological safety and security. Public access was strictly forbidden, not out of secrecy, but out of an abundance of caution regarding the dangerous pathogens being studied. For 69 years this story held, the facility operated in relative obscurity, occasionally mentioned in agricultural trade publications or academic papers, but never attracting the kind of scrutiny that might have revealed the truth. It was the perfect cover, important enough to justify a massive budget and military-level security, boring enough that most people never gave it a second thought. But as I dug deeper into the files from that flash drive, cross-referencing them with publicly available documents and declassified materials I had accumulated over years of research, the official story began to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. The first red flag was the timeline. The facility's establishment in 1954 wasn't a response to agricultural concerns. It coincided perfectly with the height of Cold War biological weapons research. This was the era of Operation Paperclip, the classified program that brought Nazi scientists to America. It was a time when both the United States and Soviet Union were racing to develop biological weapons capabilities, often using research programs that appeared innocent on the surface. When I examined the budget allocations for Plum Island during its first decade of operation, the numbers didn't add up. According to Department of Agriculture records, the facility received funding that was nearly 10 times what would have been necessary for livestock disease research. Where was all that money going? The answer became clear when I found the military correspondence hidden in the files. Letters between Defense Department officials and the facility's administrators revealed the true purpose of Plum Island. It wasn't just studying animal diseases, it was developing them as weapons. One memo from 1956, classified top secret and marked eyes only, discussed dual-use research capabilities and strategic biological countermeasures. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Plum Island was being used to develop biological weapons that could target enemy livestock and, by extension, their food supply. But it got worse, much worse. As I continued reading, I discovered references to personnel that should never have been involved in agricultural research. The most disturbing revelation was the central role played by Dr. Erich Traub, a Nazi virologist who had been recruited to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Traub wasn't just any Nazi scientist. He was Heinrich Himmler's biological warfare specialist, a man who had spent years developing ways to weaponize animal diseases for use against enemy populations. During World War II, he had worked at the Nazi biological warfare facility on Riem Island in the Baltic Sea, where he had conducted experiments that resulted in the deaths of thousands of animals and an unknown number of human subjects. According to the files, Traub hadn't just consulted on Plum Island's establishment, he had designed the entire research protocol. His signature appeared on documents dated from 1951 to 1953, 3 years before the facility officially opened. Construction blueprints showed his personal involvement in designing not just the surface laboratories, but an extensive underground facility that never appeared in any public records. One document from 1952 contained Traub's personal recommendations for the facility's research priorities. Written in his careful Germanic handwriting, it outlined a program that went far beyond studying existing diseases. Traub proposed targeted pathogen development, enhanced vector systems, and most chillingly, cross-species adaptation trials. What exactly did cross-species adaptation mean? The answer came in a research proposal dated March 1953, just months before Traub returned to Germany. The document described experiments designed to create hybrid organisms that combine the characteristics of multiple species. The goal, according to the proposal, was to develop biological assets with enhanced survivability and target specificity. Translation: they were trying to create monsters. As I dug deeper into the historical records, I found more inconsistencies that the official story couldn't explain. Construction documents showed the facility being built with capabilities far beyond what would be needed for agricultural research. There were specialized containment units designed for subjects much larger than any livestock. There were surgical suites equipped with restraint systems that looked more suited to controlling violent patients than examining sick animals. Most disturbing of all, there were references to human test subjects scattered throughout the early documents. Budget line items for volunteer compensation and subject housing appeared regularly in the facility's accounts. Medical supply orders included equipment that had no application in veterinary research, things like EEG machines, psychiatric medications, and surgical instruments designed specifically for human anatomy. One particularly chilling document from 1957 was a requisition form for restraints. The specifications called for devices capable of holding subjects weighing up to 200 pounds, with mechanisms designed to prevent violent resistance during procedures. The form was signed by Traub's successor, Dr. William Hagen, who had been brought in to continue the work after Traub's departure. By the early 1960s, the references to human subjects had become more explicit. Internal memos discussed recruitment protocols and informed consent procedures, suggesting that the facility was actively soliciting volunteers for experiments. But volunteers for what? The official research involved animal diseases that posed no direct threat to humans. The answer came in a classified report from 1963 that outlined the facility's true research agenda. The document, marked confidential, compartmentalized, described a program called Project Chimera. The goal was ambitious and terrifying: to create biological weapons that could target specific genetic markers, effectively turning human biology against itself. The research involved taking animal pathogens and modifying them to infect human subjects. But that was just the beginning. The ultimate objective was to create hybrid organisms, part human, part animal, that could serve as living weapons. These creatures would possess the intelligence and adaptability of humans, combined with the enhanced physical capabilities and disease resistance of various animal species. Reading these documents was like discovering the notes of a mad scientist. Except this wasn't fiction. This was real research, funded by the American government and conducted by respected scientists in a facility that was supposed to be protecting our food supply. As the 1960s progressed, the references to human subjects became more frequent and more detailed. Medical records described experiments that would have been considered torture by any reasonable standard. Subjects were infected with modified pathogens, subjected to genetic modification procedures, and monitored as their bodies underwent transformations that should have been impossible. One report from 1968 described a subject designated Alpha 7, who'd been infected with a modified strain of rabies that had been engineered to target specific neural pathways. Instead of causing the typical symptoms of rabies, the modified virus had enhanced the subject's physical strength and aggression while maintaining their cognitive abilities. The report noted that subject demonstrates remarkable improvements in reflexes, strength, and pain tolerance, while retaining full intellectual capacity and language skills. Another file from 1970 contained photographs that I still can't look at without feeling sick. They showed subjects in various stages of transformation, humans whose bodies had been altered through genetic manipulation to incorporate characteristics from other species. Some had elongated limbs and enhanced musculature. Others showed signs of modified sensory organs or altered bone structure. The captions beneath these photographs were written in the cold, clinical language of scientific observation, but they described horrors that belonged in the darkest corners of nightmare. Subject 23B, Day 14 post-modification, note enhanced metacarpal extension and retractable claw development. Subject 31A demonstrates successful integration of enhanced auditory organs. Range testing indicates hearing capability exceeding baseline human capacity by 400%. These weren't just medical experiments, they were attempts to create a new form of life, something that was neither fully human nor fully animal, but some terrible combination of both. And according to the timestamps on the files, this research had continued for decades, hidden behind the innocent facade of agricultural disease prevention. By the time I finished reading through the historical documents, I understood why someone had risked everything to get these files to me. This wasn't just a story about government secrecy or scientific overreach. This was evidence of crimes against humanity being committed on American soil, with American funding, in the name of national security. But what I didn't understand yet was that this was just the beginning. The historical files were horrifying, but they were also decades old. The real question was, what had happened to Project Chimera? Had it been shut down, or had it simply been moved deeper underground? The answer to that question would prove to be more terrifying than anything I had discovered in the historical records. July 12th, 2008. It was one of those perfect summer mornings on the east end of Long Island that makes you forget about the heat and humidity of the city. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that photographers spent lifetimes trying to capture. The beach at Montauk was nearly empty, except for a few early joggers and dog walkers taking advantage of the cool morning air. Jenna Hewitt was one of those early risers. A local real estate agent who had grown up in Montauk, she made a habit of walking her golden retriever Buddy along the shoreline every morning before the beach filled up with tourists. It was her quiet time, her chance to think and plan her day, while Buddy explored the driftwood and seaweed that the tide had left behind. But this morning was different. As they walked along the water's edge, Buddy suddenly stopped and began barking frantically at something washed up on the sand about 50 yards ahead. This wasn't his usual playful bark when he found an interesting piece of seaweed or a dead fish. This was the kind of aggressive, frightened barking that Jenna had only heard a few times before, usually when Buddy encountered something that genuinely scared him. As she got closer, she could see what had captured Buddy's attention. There was something lying in the sand, something roughly the size of a large dog, but with a shape that was definitely not right. From a distance, it looked like it might be a seal or a large fish that had washed ashore. But as Jenna approached, she realised that whatever this thing was, it didn't belong to any species she'd ever seen. The creature was about 4 feet long from head to tail, with a body that seemed simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. It was completely hairless, its skin a mottled grey-pink colour that looked almost human in texture but was covered in what appeared to be surgical scars. The limbs were wrong, too long and ending not in paws or flippers, but in what looked unmistakably like hands, complete with opposable thumbs and elongated fingers that ended in sharp, claw-like nails. But it was the face that made Jenna's blood run cold. The skull was elongated and narrow, ending in what appeared to be a beak-like protrusion, but the eye sockets were far too large for any known animal. Most disturbing of all, when she looked inside that bizarre mouth, she could see teeth, not the sharp fangs of a predator or the flat molars of an herbivore, but human-like incisors and canines arranged in a pattern that suggested this thing had once been capable of speech. Jenna pulled out her cell phone and started taking pictures, her hands shaking as she tried to document what she was seeing. She had lived on Long Island her entire life, had seen everything the ocean could wash ashore, but this was something that shouldn't exist. Every instinct told her to get away, to leave this thing on the beach and pretend she had never seen it. But the journalist in her, she had worked for the local newspaper during college, knew that this was important. Within hours, the photos were online. Jenna had posted them to her Facebook page with a simple caption. "Found this on Montauk Beach this morning. Anyone know what it is?" The images went viral almost immediately, spreading across social media platforms and eventually making their way to news outlets around the world. The media dubbed it the Montauk Monster, and the story became a sensation overnight. Cable news channels devoted entire segments to the mystery creature. Marine biologists and cryptozoologists offered competing theories about what it might be. Internet forums exploded with speculation ranging from the scientific to the absurd. But the official response came with suspicious speed and uniformity. Within 48 hours of the photos going public, government experts had reached a consensus. The creature was nothing more than a decomposed raccoon. The unusual appearance, they explained, was the result of prolonged exposure to salt water, which had caused the hair to fall out and the body to bloat in strange ways. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a marine biologist from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, held a press conference to explain the official findings. What people are seeing in these photographs is a perfectly normal example of how decomposition can distort the appearance of dead animals, she said, standing behind a podium adorned with government seals. When a raccoon or similar mammal is submerged in salt water for an extended period, the hair falls out, the skin takes on this grey-pink coloration, and the body bloats in ways that can make familiar animals look quite alien. The explanation was accepted by most media outlets, and the story quickly faded from public attention. Within a week, the Montauk Monster had joined the ranks of briefly famous internet mysteries, remembered mainly as an example of how people can be fooled by natural phenomena that they don't understand. But the files on that flash drive told a very different story. I found Department of Homeland Security correspondence dated July 15th, 2008, just 3 days after Jenna Hewitt's discovery. The emails were marked Priority Alpha, a classification level I had never encountered before, and they referenced something called PIS transfer, Plum Island Station transfer. The first email in the chain was from Agent Michael Torres, DHS Special Operations, to Director Sarah Chen, Office of Biosecurity. The subject line read, "Urgent, Subject 12, B Containment Breach. Immediate response required." The email was brief but chilling. "Ma'am, we have a confirmed breach at Plum Island Station. Subject 12, B broke containment during routine transfer to Kansas facility. Pursuit teams responded, but subject made it approximately 800 meters from the laboratory complex before termination protocols could be implemented. Body recovered from shoreline at Montauk Point at 0630 hours. Local civilian, identified as Jenna Hewitt, 34 real estate agent, photographed remains before we could establish scene control, recommend immediate deployment of Disinformation Protocol Delta 7. The response from Director Chen came less than 2 hours later. Approved. Implement Delta 7 immediately. Coordinate with media liaisons to ensure story containment. Standard decomposed animal narrative should suffice. We've used it successfully before. Make sure all physical evidence is secured and any additional witnesses are debriefed appropriately. This cannot become another Montauk situation. Another Montauk situation? What did that mean? The answer came in the next series of documents, which detailed the implementation of what they called Protocol Delta 7. This wasn't just damage control. It was a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to discredit and marginalise anyone who suggested that the Montauk monster was anything other than a decomposed raccoon. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the marine biologist who had given the press conference, wasn't just offering her expert opinion. According to the internal documents, she was a paid consultant for the Department of Homeland Security, specifically hired to provide scientific cover for incidents involving anomalous biological materials. Her entire career had been built on explaining away creatures and phenomena that the government needed to keep secret. But the most disturbing document was an internal incident report from the Plum Island facility itself. This wasn't the sanitized version that might eventually make its way into official records. This was a complete account of what had really happened, written by someone who had been there. According to the report, Subject 12B had been part of Project Chimera since 2003. Originally a human volunteer named David Kellerman, a 23-year-old military veteran who had responded to a classified recruitment ad promising enhanced military capabilities in exchange for participating in cutting-edge biological research. The procedures Kellerman had undergone were described in clinical detail that made my stomach turn. Over a period of 18 months, he had been subjected to genetic modification treatments designed to incorporate characteristics from multiple animal species. DNA from wolves, dolphins, and several bird species had been introduced into his system through a process the researchers called guided evolution. The results, according to the report, had exceeded expectations. Subject 12, B demonstrated enhanced strength, improved reflexes, and sensory capabilities far beyond normal human ranges. His modified physiology allowed him to hold his breath for over 20 minutes and swim at speeds approaching those of marine mammals. Most remarkably, he retained full human intelligence and memory throughout the transformation process. But there had been complications. The report noted increasing psychological instability and violent outbursts during routine procedures. Subject 12, B had become increasingly resistant to containment, making multiple escape attempts that were becoming more sophisticated over time. On July 11th, 2008, during a routine transfer from the Plum Island facility to a new research centre in Kansas, Subject 12B had managed to break free from his restraints. Security footage showed him tearing through reinforced steel like it was paper, using strength that should have been impossible even for his modified physiology. The pursuit had lasted for nearly an hour. Security teams had tracked him through the island's interior, following a trail of destruction that included shredded fencing and damaged equipment. When they finally cornered him at the island's eastern shore, Subject 12B had attempted to escape by diving into the ocean. The termination protocols were described in bureaucratic language that couldn't disguise the horror of what had actually happened. Security teams had used high-velocity sedative rounds to incapacitate the subject in the water, then implemented standard termination procedures to prevent potential exposure risks. They had murdered him, shot him full of drugs to stop his enhanced body from swimming to safety, then killed him to prevent anyone from discovering what they had done to him. The report noted that complete specimen recovery was not possible due to tidal conditions and the proximity of civilian areas. David Kellerman's body had washed ashore on Montauk Beach, where Jenna Hewitt had found it and photographed it before the government could cover up yet another atrocity committed in the name of national security. The photographs in the classified files showed the creature from angles that had never appeared in the media coverage. These images revealed details that the official decomposed raccoon explanation couldn't account for. The surgical scars that marked every inch of his body, evidence of dozens of procedures, the implant sites behind his skull, where monitoring devices had been inserted to track his biological functions. And most heartbreaking of all, a small tattoo on his left shoulder, a military insignia that identified him as a member of the 101st Airborne Division. David Kellerman had been a decorated veteran who had served his country in Afghanistan. He had volunteered for what he thought was a program to help create better soldiers, to give military personnel the tools they needed to survive in hostile environments. Instead, he had been turned into a monster, imprisoned for years as a test subject, and finally murdered to protect the secrets of a program that should never have existed. The Montauk Monster wasn't a decomposed raccoon. It was evidence of a government program that was using American citizens as subjects in biological experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. And according to the timestamps on these files, David Kellerman was just one of many subjects who had been transformed, studied, and ultimately disposed of when they became inconvenient. As I sat in my apartment reading these documents, I realised that I was looking at evidence of ongoing crimes against humanity. This wasn't historical research. This was happening right now, funded by American taxpayers and conducted by government agencies that were supposed to protect us. But I also realised something else. If they were willing to murder David Kellerman to protect their secrets, what would they do to a journalist who was threatening to expose them? The deeper I dug into Dr. Eric Traub's background, the more convinced I became that his involvement with Plum Island was the key to understanding the entire conspiracy. This wasn't just another Nazi scientist looking for redemption in America. This was a man whose work during World War II had been so horrific that even other Nazi scientists had considered him extreme. Traub's story began in 1906, when he was born into a middle-class German family in Insel Reims, a small island in the Baltic Sea that would later become the site of his most infamous work. He studied veterinary medicine and virology at the University of Berlin, where he quickly distinguished himself as a brilliant but ruthless researcher who was willing to push ethical boundaries that his colleagues wouldn't cross. When the Nazis rose to power, Traub saw an opportunity. He joined the party early, in 1937, and began conducting research into biological warfare at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biochemistry. His early work focused on foot and mouth disease, a highly contagious virus that affects livestock. While other researchers were studying the disease to prevent outbreaks, Traub was interested in weaponizing it. By 1940, Traub had been promoted to director of the Nazi biological warfare program and given his own facility on Reims Island, the same island where he had been born. The Reims laboratory became Nazi Germany's primary biological weapons research centre, conducting experiments that went far beyond anything that had been attempted before. The files from the flash drive contained translated excerpts from Traub's personal research notes, written in his careful German script. Reading them was like looking into the mind of a man who had completely abandoned any pretense of human decency in pursuit of scientific advancement. One entry, dated March 1942, described his work with what he called enhanced vector systems, basically attempts to create disease-carrying insects and animals that could be used to spread biological weapons over wide areas. Traub had been experimenting with ticks, mosquitoes, and various bird species, modifying them genetically to make them more effective carriers of deadly pathogens. Another note, from September 1943, detailed experiments in cross-species pathology transfer, attempts to create hybrid diseases that could jump between animal species and eventually infect humans. Traub believed that by combining characteristics from multiple pathogens, he could create biological weapons that would be impossible to defend against because they would be unlike anything that had existed in nature. But it was a research report from January 1944 that revealed the true scope of Traub's depravity. The document described a series of experiments conducted on human prisoners, Soviet POWs and political prisoners who had been transferred to Reims Island for medical research. Traub had been infecting these subjects with modified versions of animal diseases to study how the pathogens affected human physiology. The language was clinical and detached, describing human beings as if they were laboratory equipment. Subject 47 demonstrates typical response pattern to modified strain BW-7. Initial infection proceeds normally, but enhanced viral load produces accelerated symptom development. Subject expired after 72 hours, significantly faster than baseline projections. Recommend adjustment of viral concentration for future trials. These weren't just medical experiments. They were torture sessions disguised as research. Traub was systematically murdering prisoners to test biological weapons, keeping detailed notes on their suffering for future reference. As the war turned against Germany, Traub's research became more desperate and more extreme. A report from March 1945, just weeks before the Nazi surrender, described his final project, an attempt to create what he called biological chimeras, hybrid organisms that combined human intelligence with animal characteristics. The research notes describe procedures that sounded like something from a medieval torture chamber. Human subjects were injected with modified animal DNA, subjected to experimental surgeries to graft animal organs into their bodies, and monitored as their bodies underwent forced evolutionary changes. Most of the subjects died within days, but Traub noted that a few had survived long enough to demonstrate promising developmental changes. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Traub destroyed most of his research and fled to the American zone of occupation. He was captured by US forces in June and initially held as a war criminal, but instead of being put on trial for his crimes, he was recruited for Operation Paperclip, the classified program that brought Nazi scientists to America. The justification was simple. The Cold War was beginning, and the United States needed biological weapons capabilities to counter the Soviet threat. Traub's expertise in weaponizing animal diseases made him too valuable to prosecute. His war crimes were classified, his victims were forgotten, and he was given a new life in America as a reformed scientist, working to protect American agriculture. But the files showed that Traub had never reformed. The research he'd conducted for the Nazis was simply continued under American sponsorship, with American funding, using American test subjects. Traub arrived at Plum Island in 1951, 2 years before the facility officially opened to conduct agricultural research. His job was to design the research protocols and containment systems that would guide the facility's work for decades to come. But what he actually designed was a continuation of the biological weapons program he had run for the Nazis. His personal notes from this period, translated from German and included in the files, revealed his true intentions. In an entry dated August 1952, he wrote, "The Americans are naive. They believe they are hiring me to protect their livestock from disease, but they are actually providing me with the resources to perfect the work I began in Germany. Here, I have unlimited funding, sophisticated equipment, and access to subjects who volunteer willingly. It is the ideal situation for advancing biological warfare research." Traub's research priorities at Plum Island were identical to what he had been doing for the Nazis, developing biological weapons that could target both animals and humans, creating enhanced vector systems for delivering these weapons, and experimenting with genetic modification to create hybrid organisms. One research proposal from 1953 outlined his plan for tick vector viability studies. Officially, this research was described as an effort to understand how ticks spread diseases to livestock. But Traub's private notes revealed that he was actually trying to create weaponized ticks that could be used to spread biological agents across enemy territory. The timing was impossible to ignore. Traub had been conducting extensive research on tick-borne pathogens from 1951 to 1953. In 1975, just 22 years after he left Plum Island, the first cases of Lyme disease were identified in Old Lyme, Connecticut, directly across Long Island Sound from the facility. Lyme disease is caused by a bacterium called Borrelia burgdorferi, which is spread by tick bites. The disease had never been documented in North America before 1975, despite centuries of European settlement and extensive medical record keeping. The official explanation was that climate change and suburban development had brought humans into closer contact with infected ticks, but this theory didn't explain why the disease had appeared so suddenly in a specific geographic area. Traub's research notes provided a much more disturbing explanation. In a laboratory journal entry from March 1953, he had written, "Vector trials demonstrate successful pathogen transmission in 87% of test subjects. Borrelia variant shows particular promise due to delayed symptom onset, and potential for chronic manifestation. Recommend field testing to assess natural dispersal patterns. Suggest target area within 50-kilometre radius of facility for optimal monitoring capabilities. Old Lyme, Connecticut falls exactly within that radius. But the most chilling document was a progress report dated May 1953, just months before Traub returned to Germany. The report described successful creation of what he called enhanced Borrelia strains, genetically modified versions of the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. These enhanced strains were designed to be more infectious, more resistant to treatment, and capable of causing a wider range of symptoms than the natural version. According to Traub's notes, field testing of these enhanced strains was conducted in the summer of 1953. The testing involved releasing infected ticks into wooded areas across southern New England and monitoring the spread of disease in both animal and human populations. The research was disguised as a study of a natural tick behaviour, but it was actually a biological weapons test conducted on an unknowing American population. The results, Traub noted, exceeded expectations. The enhanced Borrelia strains spread rapidly through local deer and mouse populations exactly as predicted. Human infections began appearing within months, but because the symptoms were unfamiliar to American doctors, the cases were misdiagnosed as arthritis, chronic fatigue, or psychiatric disorders. By the time Traub left Plum Island in late 1953, he had established what he called a perfect biological weapons testing ground. The enhanced Lyme disease strains would continue spreading naturally for decades, providing ongoing data about the long-term effects of biological weapons deployment. Local doctors would continue misdiagnosing cases, ensuring that the true extent of the outbreak would never be properly documented. It wasn't until 1975, 22 years later, that a cluster of children in Old Lyme developed obvious symptoms that couldn't be ignored or misdiagnosed. By then, the enhanced Lyme disease strains had spread throughout the northeastern United States, infecting hundreds of thousands of people who had no idea they were victims of a biological weapons test conducted by a Nazi scientist working for the American government. Was Lyme disease an accident, the result of a containment breach or improper disposal of research materials? Or was it a deliberate test of biological weapons capabilities conducted on an unwitting American population? The evidence in Traub's files pointed clearly toward the latter conclusion. The implications were staggering. Lyme disease now affects over 300,000 Americans annually, causing chronic pain, neurological damage, and in some cases, permanent disability. The medical community still struggles to diagnose and treat the condition effectively, partly because they don't understand that they're dealing with an artificially enhanced pathogen rather than a natural disease. Every person suffering from Lyme disease, every family dealing with the chronic health problems it causes, every medical bill and lost day of work, it's all the result of a biological weapons test conducted by a Nazi war criminal who was given safe haven in America instead of being prosecuted for his crimes. But as horrific as this revelation was, I was beginning to understand that Lyme disease was just the beginning. Traub's time at Plum Island had been brief, less than 3 years, but he had established research protocols and methodologies that continued long after his departure. The biological weapons program he had designed for the Nazis was now being carried out by American scientists, using American subjects with American funding. And according to the timestamps on the files I was reading, it was still going on. 3 weeks after I began investigating the Plum Island files, I had reached what felt like a dead end. The documents from the flash drive had given me pieces of a horrific puzzle, but they raised more questions than they answered. I needed someone who had actually been inside the facility, someone who could confirm that the experiments described in those files had really taken place. That's when I received an encrypted email that would change everything. The message appeared in my inbox on a Thursday morning, sent from an account that appeared to have been created specifically for this communication. The sender identified himself only as Silas, and the message was brief but compelling. Mr. Adler, I've been following your work for years. Your investigation of the CIA's domestic surveillance programs was excellent journalism. Now I see you're asking questions about Plum Island. You're getting close to something that very few people understand, but you're also putting yourself in danger. The people responsible for what happened there have unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. They've silenced others who got too close to the truth. If you want to understand what really happened on that island, and what's still happening now, meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the Riverhead Diner on Route 58. Come alone, order the apple pie. It's surprisingly good and it will let me know you're the right person. Don't bring recording equipment or your phone. If you're being followed, just leave. I'll know. I worked there for 13 years. I saw things that still give me nightmares. But someone needs to tell this story before it's too late. Every professional instinct told me this was a bad idea. Meeting unknown sources in remote locations is exactly how journalists end up disappeared or dead. But I had already committed myself to this story, and I needed verification that the files I'd been studying were authentic. The Riverhead Diner was exactly what you'd expect from a Long Island roadside establishment that had been serving truckers and locals since the 1960s. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and a menu that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. The kind of place where conversations could disappear into the ambient noise of sizzling bacon and clinking coffee cups. I ordered the apple pie and waited. At 2:15, a man slid into the booth across from me without introduction. He was in his early 60s, thin to the point of being gaunt, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of nervous energy that comes from carrying secrets too heavy to bear alone. His hands shook slightly as he stirred sugar into his coffee, and his eyes constantly scanned the diner as if he expected trouble to walk through the door at any moment. "You're James Adler," he said. It wasn't a question. "And you're Silas." He nodded, then leaned forward and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Before we start, you need to understand something. The people we're talking about, they have resources you can't imagine. They have surveillance capabilities that make the NSA look like amateurs. They have operatives embedded in law enforcement, the media, and every level of government. If they decide you're a threat, you won't see it coming." "Then why are you talking to me?" "Because I'm dying," he said matter-of-factly. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm lucky. After what I've seen, what I've been part of, I figure I owe it to the world to tell the truth before I go." Silas claimed to have worked at Plum Island from 1982 to 1995 as a research technician. His job had been to maintain the facility's containment systems, monitor the environmental controls, and provide technical support for the various research projects being conducted there. He was low-level enough to avoid scrutiny, but high-level enough to have access to areas of the facility that most employees never saw. "When I started there," he continued, "I thought I was working for the Department of Agriculture. That's what it said on my paychecks. That's what I put on my tax returns. I believed I was helping to protect American livestock from disease. For the first few years, that's all I saw. Legitimate research into foot and mouth disease, swine fever, that sort of thing." But by the mid-1980s, Silas had begun to notice things that didn't fit with the facility's agricultural mission. Shipments arriving in the unmarked trucks in the middle of the night. Sections of the facility that were off-limits even to employees with high-level security clearances. Research subjects that looked nothing like any farm animals he had ever seen. "They started with good intentions," he said, constantly glancing around the diner. "They really did want to protect American agriculture. But intentions have a way of changing when you're dealing with the unlimited budgets and no oversight. The research kept getting more extreme, more ambitious. Pretty soon, they weren't just studying diseases, they were creating them." According to Silas, the research had evolved in 3 distinct phases, just as the historical documents had suggested. Phase 1 involved attempts to make livestock immune to various diseases through genetic modification. The goal was to create cattle, pigs, and other farm animals that could resist biological warfare agents that might be used against American agriculture. The genetic modification work was incredibly advanced, Silas explained. This was back in the 1980s, remember, when most people had never heard of DNA manipulation. But these scientists were doing things that wouldn't become public knowledge for another 20 years. They were inserting genes from one species into another, creating animals that were part cow and part something else. When the livestock modification proved too difficult and unpredictable, the research had shifted to Phase 2, attempting to make humans immune to biological weapons. The idea was to create soldiers and intelligence operatives who could function in contaminated environments, giving American forces a significant tactical advantage in biological warfare scenarios. That's when they started recruiting human volunteers, Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. They put out classified ads in military publications, offering enhanced physical capabilities in exchange for participating in cutting-edge biological research. Young soldiers who wanted to serve their country better, athletes who wanted to push the boundaries of human performance, they all thought they were signing up for something patriotic and noble. The human enhancement experiments had initially focused on disease resistance, but the researchers quickly realised they could do much more. If they could modify human DNA to resist pathogens, why not modify it to enhance other capabilities as well? Strength, speed, sensory perception, healing ability, all of these became targets for genetic manipulation. I started seeing the subjects around 1987, Silas continued. At first they looked normal, just regular people who were a little stronger and faster than they should have been. But the modifications kept getting more extreme. The scientists weren't satisfied with making people 10% better. They wanted dramatic improvements, changes that would create a new category of human being. But it was Phase 3 that had truly horrified Silas and eventually driven him to quit his job and disappear into anonymity for nearly 30 years. In the early 1990s, the researchers had abandoned attempts to enhance normal humans and had begun creating entirely new forms of life. They stopped trying to make humans resistant to animal diseases, Silas whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. They started trying to make hybrids, creatures that combined human intelligence with animal capabilities, and they succeeded. He told me about something he called the room below the waterline, a submerged laboratory that had been built beneath the main facility in the late 1980s. This underwater complex was where the most extreme experiments took place, hidden even from most of the researchers working on the surface. I only saw it once, he said, his voice barely audible above the diner's ambient noise. There was an electrical problem with the main lab's power systems, and they needed someone to check the backup generators. They gave me temporary clearance for the lower levels with an escort who never left my side. What Silas described sounded like something from a science fiction nightmare, but his description matched details I had found in the classified files. The submerged facility consisted of dozens of holding cells with reinforced glass walls, each containing creatures that defied classification. Some of them had started as animals and been modified to be more human-like, he continued. Others had started as humans and been changed into something else. But the worst ones were the ones they had built from scratch, genetic combinations that had never existed in nature. Silas claimed to have seen beings that combined human and canine characteristics, creatures with elongated limbs and enhanced sensory organs, and things that moved and communicated in ways that suggested intelligence while possessing bodies that were clearly no longer human. The thing that haunted me the most, he said, his voice breaking slightly, was that some of them recognized me. When I walked past their cells, they would watch me work, and I could see intelligence in their eyes. Not animal intelligence, human intelligence, trapped in bodies that weren't quite either. One creature in particular had stayed with Silas for decades. He described it as roughly human-sized, but with proportions that were wrong. Limbs too long, joints that bent in directions they shouldn't, and hands that ended in retractable claws. But when it looked at him, he could see something unmistakably human in its eyes. It tried to communicate with me, Silas said, tears forming in his eyes. It couldn't speak. Its throat had been modified in ways that made human speech impossible, but it kept making gestures, trying to tell me something. I realised it was trying to write, trying to form letters in the air. S-A-V-E-M-E. Save me. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, but it had changed Silas forever. When he returned to his normal duties on the surface levels, he began paying closer attention to the facility's operations. He started noticing the transportation schedules, the supply deliveries, the personnel rotations, and he began to understand the true scope of what was happening. They weren't just conducting experiments, he explained. They were mass-producing these creatures. By the early 1990s, they had dozens of subjects in various stages of modification. Some were recent arrivals who still looked mostly human. Others had been there for years, transformed beyond recognition. But in 1992, something had gone wrong. Silas described it as the incident that changed everything, a containment breach that had nearly exposed the entire program to public scrutiny. One of the subjects, I never knew its designation, but the researchers called it Alpha, had been planned for termination. Its modifications had been unsuccessful, and it was becoming increasingly aggressive and unpredictable, but somehow it escaped from its holding cell. The creature had made it through 3 levels of security before being cornered in the underwater facility's main corridor. Security teams had used tranquilizer weapons to subdue it, but not before it had caused significant damage to the containment systems. The breach flooded half the lower levels, Silas explained. They had to seal off entire sections of the facility and relocate the subjects to temporary holding areas on the surface. For about 6 months, there were creatures being held in buildings that weren't designed for that kind of containment. It was during this period that several subjects had escaped from the facility entirely, leading to sightings of strange creatures throughout eastern Long Island. Most of these escapees were recaptured quickly, but a few had made it off the island before security teams could respond. That's when they implemented what they called the disinformation protocols, Silas said. Whenever someone reported seeing something unusual, a strange animal, an unexplained creature, the response teams would show up within hours. They had cover stories prepared for everything: diseased raccoons, escaped pets, hoaxes by attention-seeking locals. The 1992 incident had also led to major changes in the facility's operations. The damaged underwater laboratory was permanently sealed, and many of the experiments were relocated to other facilities. By 1995, when Silas finally quit his job, Plum Island was being used primarily as a coordination centre for a biological weapons program that had spread to multiple locations across the United States. That's why I left, he said, finishing his coffee and preparing to go. I couldn't be part of it anymore. I'd seen too much, participated in too many atrocities. I took early retirement, moved to a small town upstate, and tried to forget everything I'd learned. But forgetting had proved impossible. For nearly 30 years, Silas had carried the weight of what he'd witnessed, the knowledge of crimes against humanity being committed by his own government. The cancer diagnosis had finally motivated him to speak out, but he was terrified of the consequences. They monitor everyone who worked there, he warned me, even retired employees like me. They know where I live, what I do, who I talk to. If they find out about this conversation, they'll know I'm the leak. As he slid out of the booth, Silas handed me a small piece of paper with a phone number written in pencil. If something happens to me, call this number. Tell them Silas sent you, and mention the room below the waterline. They'll know what to do with the backup files. Who are they? I asked. Other people like me, he said. Employees who couldn't live with what they'd seen. Scientists who refused to continue the research. Security personnel who kept copies of evidence. We'd been watching each other's backs for decades, waiting for someone like you to tell this story. 2 weeks later, Silas's car was found abandoned on a rural road outside Riverhead. The keys were still in the ignition, his wallet and cell phone on the passenger seat, but there was no sign of Silas himself. Local police classified it as a missing person case, noting that he had been receiving treatment for terminal cancer and might have wandered off in a confused state. But I knew better. Silas had been taken, just like others who had gotten too close to the truth about Plum Island. The phone number he'd given me? Disconnected, with no record that it had ever been in service. I was on my own now, with nothing but a flash drive full of classified files and a growing certainty that powerful people were already aware of my investigation. The metadata on the flash drive files had been bothering me since I first examined them. Most of the documents showed original creation dates between 1996 and 2003, placing them well within the digital age when government files would have been routinely archived and catalogued. Yet when I searched for these documents in public databases, Freedom of Information Act releases, and declassified government archives, I found nothing. It was as if these files had been completely scrubbed from the official record, their existence denied at every level of government. This kind of systematic information suppression required resources and authority that went far beyond typical classification procedures. Someone with significant power had decided that these particular documents should never see the light of day. One file in particular captured my attention, a video with a timestamp from August 15, 2001. The file name was innocuous enough. PIS Medical Eval 47B.AVE. But when I opened it, I found myself looking at footage that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The video was clearly shot through an observation window, probably using a security camera or similar surveillance equipment. The image quality was poor, grainy and low resolution, but clear enough to show the details of what was happening in the room beyond. The setting appeared to be a medical examination room, but unlike anything you'd find in a normal hospital. The walls were covered in white ceramic tiles that could be easily sterilised, and harsh fluorescent lighting gave everything a cold, clinical appearance. Stainless steel equipment lined the walls, monitoring devices, surgical instruments, and restraint mechanisms that looked more suited to controlling violent patients than conducting medical examinations. In the centre of the room was an examination table, but it was unlike any medical furniture I had ever seen. It was constructed from heavy steel and equipped with multiple restraint systems, leather straps, metal clamps, and what appeared to be electronic monitoring devices built directly into the surface. The entire apparatus could be adjusted and repositioned, apparently to accommodate subjects of different sizes and shapes. Strapped to this table was something that made my hands shake as I watched. The creature was roughly human-sized, but its proportions were fundamentally wrong. The limbs were too long, extending at angles that suggested additional joints or modified bone structure. The torso was narrow and elongated, covered in skin that had a greyish mottled appearance. But it was the head that was truly disturbing. The skull had been surgically modified, extended and reshaped in ways that suggested the brain cavity had been enlarged to accommodate additional tissue. Most horrifying of all, the creature was clearly conscious and aware. Its eyes, still recognisably human despite everything else that had been done to it, tracked the movement of figures in white coats who moved in and out of the camera's field of view. When these figures approached with instruments or monitoring devices, the creature would struggle against its restraints, making sounds that were unmistakably expressions of fear and pain. The audio quality was poor, muffled by what sounded like soundproofing materials, but I could make out fragments of conversation between the researchers. Heart rate elevated, but within acceptable parameters for this stage of modification. Neural activity suggests higher cognitive function than we observed in previous subjects. Increase the sedation level before we begin the next phase of tissue sampling. Note the enhanced muscle development in the extremities that's consistent with the genetic modifications from the canine DNA integration. The creature on the table suddenly began to scream, not the cry of an animal, but something that was unmistakably, heart-breakingly human in its terror and anguish. The sound was cut short as one of the figures in white coats administered an injection, and the creature's struggles gradually subsided into unconsciousness. The video continued for another 10 minutes, showing the researchers conducting what appeared to be a routine medical examination. They took tissue samples, recorded measurements, and documented their observations with the detached professionalism of scientists studying a laboratory specimen. But the subject they were examining had once been a human being, someone with thoughts and feelings and a life outside this sterile chamber of horrors. Other video files contained similar footage from different time periods and with different subjects. Some showed creatures that appeared to be more heavily modified, their human characteristics almost completely obscured by genetic alterations. Others documented subjects in earlier stages of transformation, still recognisably human, but showing clear signs of ongoing biological changes. One particularly disturbing video from 1999 showed a subject that appeared to be a young woman, probably in her 20s. She had volunteered for the programme, according to a briefing document I found in the same folder, responding to a recruitment ad that promised enhanced physical capabilities for military service. The initial modifications had been successful. She demonstrated strength and agility far beyond normal human ranges, but subsequent procedures had gone wrong. The video showed her strapped to the same type of examination table, but unlike other subjects, she was awake and able to speak. She was pleading with the researchers, begging them to stop the procedures and let her go home. Her voice was distorted by modifications to her throat and vocal cords, but her words were clearly understandable. "Please, I want to go home. You said this was temporary. You said I could go back to my unit when the testing was finished. Please, I have a family. I have a little sister who's getting married next month. Please let me call them." The researchers ignored her pleas, discussing her case as if she weren't there. According to their conversation, the subject was scheduled for terminal evaluation, apparently a euphemism for euthanasia, because the genetic modifications had caused irreversible psychological damage. Subject 34C demonstrates increasing emotional instability, one researcher noted. Memory retention appears intact, but behavioural modifications suggest incompatibility with reintegration protocols. Recommend implementing standard termination procedures. The video ended there, but I found a follow-up document dated 3 days later that confirmed the subject had been terminated as per standard protocols, and that her remains had been processed through standard disposal channels. She had been murdered. A young woman who had volunteered to serve her country, who had trusted government scientists to enhance her capabilities for military service, had been killed when the experiments went wrong. And according to the clinical language in these reports, she was just one of dozens of subjects who had met similar fates. Email exchanges between researchers provided additional insight into the scope and nature of the program. The correspondence revealed a project called Operation Chimera that had been running continuously since the 1950s, evolving from Eric Traub's original biological weapons research into something far more ambitious and terrifying. One email thread from March 2002 discussed the program's goals in terms that made my blood run cold. The researchers were no longer content with creating enhanced soldiers or biological weapons. They were attempting to engineer an entirely new form of intelligent life, beings that combined human cognitive abilities with enhanced physical characteristics derived from various animal species. Dr. Richard Steinberg, who appeared to be the project's lead researcher, wrote, "Our analysis confirms that genetic blending at the cellular level is not only possible, but highly reproducible." Subject 18. C demonstrates remarkable healing capabilities following tissue damage. Bone fractures show 400% faster recovery than baseline human subjects. Muscle density has increased by 60% while maintaining normal flexibility and range of motion. Most significantly, cognitive testing shows no degradation in intelligence or memory function following the modifications. However, the email continued with a troubling observation. Primary concern remains the psychological impact of the transformation process. Subjects consistently demonstrate increased aggression levels and difficulty with emotional regulation. Recommend implementation of psychological conditioning protocols in the next iteration to address behavioural anomalies. Another researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, responded with details about what these psychological conditioning protocols involved. Behavioural modification through controlled trauma exposure has shown promise in previous trials. Subjects who undergo systematic desensitization procedures demonstrate improved compliance and reduced resistance to additional modifications. Recommend expanding the conditioning program to include memory suppression techniques. They were torturing their subjects into compliance, using psychological abuse to break their resistance to increasingly extreme procedures, and they were documenting it all with the same clinical detachment they might use to describe adjustments to laboratory equipment. A progress report from 2003 contained information that made me physically ill as I read it. The researchers had achieved what Dr. Steinberg called breakthrough results in cognitive transfer trials. They had successfully created subjects that retained their pre-modification memory and language capabilities while demonstrating dramatically enhanced physical parameters. Subject 23A represents the culmination of 15 years of research, Steinberg wrote. Pre-modification, 22-year-old male, 5 feet 10 inches, 180 pounds, standard human physical capabilities. Post-modification, enhanced strength, 800% increase, improved reflexes, 400% improvement, enhanced sensory perception, particularly hearing and night vision, accelerated healing, and partial temperature resistance. Subject retains full memory of pre-modification life and demonstrates no cognitive impairment. Language skills remain intact, though vocal modifications have altered speech patterns. But the report also noted ongoing problems. Subject demonstrates extreme psychological distress regarding physical alterations. Persistent requests for reversal procedures and contact with family members may require additional conditioning to ensure operational compliance. This wasn't enhancement, it was torture. They were taking healthy young people and transforming them into something that was no longer entirely human, then subjecting them to psychological abuse when they reacted with predictable horror to what had been done to them. When I attempted to publish my initial findings, submitting articles to 3 different investigative journalism platforms, something unprecedented happened. Within 1 hour of submission, all 3 articles had been removed from their respective websites. The first editor I contacted claimed there had been a server error that corrupted the file. The second said there were technical difficulties with the content management system. The third, a platform I had worked with successfully for years, claimed there had been a sudden change in editorial direction that made my article unsuitable for publication. But I knew the truth. The internet doesn't move that fast unless someone is already watching, already waiting to suppress information the moment it appears. Someone with the resources and authority to monitor online publication platforms, identify threatening content and suppress it within minutes of it going live. That night I began sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed and checking my apartment for surveillance equipment every morning before I started work. I also started backing up my files to multiple secure locations, distributing copies to trusted contacts who had instructions to release them if something happened to me. I was no longer just investigating a story. I was in a race against time, trying to expose the truth before powerful people could silence me permanently. In 2023, nearly 70 years after its establishment, the Plum Island Animal Disease Centre was officially decommissioned. The announcement was made with little fanfare, a brief press release from the Department of Agriculture noting that the facility's operations would be transferred to the new National Bio and Agro Defense Facility in Manhattan, Kansas. The official reasoning was straightforward and logical. Plum Island's infrastructure had become outdated after decades of use. The new Kansas facility would provide upgraded capabilities for protecting American agriculture in the 21st century, with better containment systems, more advanced research equipment, and improved security measures. It was presented as a routine modernization, the kind of bureaucratic efficiency improvement that happens regularly in government agencies. Local newspapers covered the story as a minor economic development issue. The closure would eliminate several hundred jobs on Long Island, while the Kansas facility would bring similar employment opportunities to the Midwest. Environmental groups expressed cautious optimism that the island might eventually be converted into a nature preserve. A few conspiracy theorists on internet forums speculated about cover-ups and secret research, but their theories were easily dismissed as the usual paranoid fantasizing. But the files I had discovered told a very different story about what was really being transferred to Kansas. Transportation manifests dated from late 2022 and early 2023 documented the movement of materials from Plum Island to the new facility. Most of the entries appeared routine: laboratory equipment, research samples, administrative records, and the other mundane necessities of relocating a major research operation. But mixed among the standard items were entries that raised disturbing questions. 12 items on the manifest were classified at levels that required redaction, even in internal transportation documents. The entries showed only shipment dates, special handling codes, and transport protocols that indicated extremely hazardous materials. One partially visible entry was labelled Subject Omega, Status Dormant, Transport Protocol, Class X Containment, Warning, do not expose to UV radiation under any circumstances. What was Subject Omega? And what kind of biological material required protection from ultraviolet light? Other redacted entries referenced genetic material archives, preserved tissue samples, and viable cellular cultures. The language suggested that these weren't just research specimens. They were living materials that required specialized life support systems during transportation. Photographs accompanying the shipping documents showed equipment being loaded onto specialized transport vehicles. These weren't standard moving trucks or laboratory supply vehicles. They appeared to be custom-built containment systems, heavily armoured and equipped with what looked like life support and environmental control systems. More disturbing still were the images of sealed incinerators on Plum Island, their interiors scorched black from what appeared to be recent use. Someone had been destroying evidence, burning materials that were too sensitive to risk transferring to the new facility. But according to the shipping manifests, the most critical materials, including whatever constituted Subject Omega, had been carefully relocated rather than destroyed. I began researching the new National Bio and Agro-Defence Facility, hoping to understand what kind of research would be conducted there, and what capabilities it would have for containing the materials transferred from Plum Island. What I discovered only deepened my concerns. The MBF wasn't just a replacement for Plum Island, it was an exponential expansion of America's biological research capabilities. While Plum Island had occupied less than 900 acres on a small island, the Kansas facility sprawled across thousands of acres in the heart of America's agricultural region. The official budget for construction and equipment was over $1.25 billion, making it one of the most expensive government research facilities ever built. More troubling was the facility's expanded research mandate. While Plum Island had been officially restricted to studying foreign animal diseases, NBAF was authorized to conduct research on dual-use biological agents, pathogens that could be used for both defensive and offensive purposes. This was essentially a euphemism for biological weapons research, the kind of work that had been conducted secretly at Plum Island but could now be done openly under the expanded mission statement. Construction documents for the Kansas facility revealed capabilities that far exceeded anything that had existed on Plum Island. The surface facilities included multiple high-containment laboratories, rated at Biosafety Level 4, the highest classification for handling the most dangerous pathogens known to science. But it was the underground facilities that truly concerned me. Architectural blueprints showed multiple subterranean levels extending more than 50 feet below ground. These underground laboratories were classified at security levels that weren't even named in the public documentation. They were simply referred to as compartmentalized access areas that required special authorization codes for entry. The underground facility included holding areas described as large animal containment units, but the specifications suggested they were designed for subjects much larger and more dangerous than any traditional livestock. The containment cells were equipped with reinforced steel barriers, automated feeding systems, and what appeared to be restraint mechanisms built into the walls and floors. Most ominously, the facility included what the blueprints referred to as subject modification areas, surgical suites equipped with restraint tables and monitoring equipment that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the facilities I had seen in the video files from Plum Island. They hadn't shut down the program. They had simply moved it to a location with better security, more advanced equipment, and fewer potential witnesses. Whatever had been happening on that island off the Long Island coast was now continuing in the American heartland, hidden beneath the Kansas prairie where no casual observers would notice unusual activity. But the most disturbing aspect of the transfer was its timing. Construction of the Kansas facility had begun in 2008, the same year that the Montauk Monster had washed ashore and nearly exposed the Plum Island program to public scrutiny. The decision to relocate hadn't been driven by infrastructure concerns or modernization needs. It had been a response to the growing risk of exposure. The 2008 incident had demonstrated that Plum Island was no longer a secure location for the kind of research being conducted there. The island was too close to populated areas, too accessible to curious researchers and investigative journalists. When David Kellerman's transformed body had washed up on Montauk Beach, it had nearly blown the cover on 70 years of illegal human experimentation. Kansas offered everything that Plum Island lacked: isolation from major population centres, minimal media coverage, and a political environment where questioning government activities was discouraged. The facility was located in a region where most residents were employed either directly or indirectly by government contractors, creating a community with strong incentives to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. I found evidence that the transfer process had been carefully planned for years before it was officially announced. Preliminary site surveys of the Kansas location dated back to 2005, and some personnel transfers had begun as early as 2010. The public announcement in 2023 wasn't the beginning of the relocation. It was the final step in a process that had been underway for nearly 2 decades. During this extended transition period, research operations had been divided between the two facilities. The most sensitive projects remained at Plum Island until the Kansas underground laboratories were completed, while routine activities were gradually shifted to the new location. This meant that for over a decade, the biological weapons program had been operating at 2 locations simultaneously, effectively doubling its capacity for human experimentation. Personnel records showed that key researchers from the Plum Island program had been relocated to Kansas years before the official facility closure. Dr. Richard Steinberg, whose emails I had found in the classified files, had been appointed as the NBAF's Director of Advanced Research in 2019. Dr. Margaret Voss, who had developed the psychological conditioning protocols used on human subjects, had been transferred to head the facility's Behavioural Modification Department in 2020. The continuity of personnel made it clear that this wasn't just a relocation, it was an expansion. The same scientists who had conducted illegal human experiments at Plum Island were now running a much larger operation in Kansas, with better equipment, more funding, and even less oversight. As I continued my research into the Kansas facility, I discovered that construction had included features that hadn't been part of the original plans. Multiple underground levels had been added during the building process, expanding the facility's capacity far beyond what had been publicly announced. These additional levels were funded through black budget appropriations that didn't appear in any public records. Satellite imagery of the construction site, available through commercial services, showed the facility being built in phases. The official above-ground laboratories were completed first, allowing the facility to begin routine operations while construction continued on the classified underground levels. By 2022, the underground expansion was complete, but its existence was never acknowledged in any public documentation. The most troubling discovery was a series of transportation records showing regular shipments between the Kansas facility and various medical institutions across the country. These shipments were classified as biological research materials, but the frequency and volume suggested something more than routine academic collaboration. Cross-referencing the shipping dates with missing person reports from nearby cities, I found a pattern that made my blood run cold. Young adults who matched the demographic profile of previous Plum Island subjects, military veterans, athletes, individuals seeking enhanced physical capabilities, were disappearing at rates significantly higher than statistical norms in areas surrounding the Kansas facility. The disappearances weren't concentrated enough to attract media attention or law enforcement investigation, but when viewed collectively, they suggested an ongoing recruitment program. People who fit the target profile were being approached with offers of employment or research participation, then vanishing without trace. I found recruitment materials that had been distributed through military publications and fitness magazines, advertising opportunities for cutting-edge human performance research and enhanced capability development. The ads promised significant financial compensation and the chance to push the boundaries of human potential while serving national security interests. The language was carefully crafted to attract young people who were looking for adventure and the chance to serve their country, the same demographic that had been targeted by the Plum Island program for decades. But unlike the earlier recruitment efforts, which had been relatively small scale, the Kansas operation appeared to be recruiting subjects by the hundreds. Medical supply orders for the facility, obtained through sources I cannot identify without putting them at risk, showed purchases that far exceeded what would be needed for agricultural research. Surgical equipment, anesthetics, genetic modification materials, and pharmaceutical compounds used in experimental treatments were being ordered in quantities that suggested large-scale human experimentation. Most disturbing of all, the facility had ordered specialized equipment for subject disposal, industrial incinerators capable of completely destroying organic matter, leaving no trace that could be detected by forensic analysis. The same equipment had been used at Plum Island, but the Kansas facility had ordered units with 10 times the capacity. The implications were staggering. Not only had the biological weapons program continued after the Plum Island closure, it had expanded dramatically. The Kansas facility was conducting human experiments on a scale that dwarfed anything that had been done before, with improved techniques for hiding the evidence and disposing of subjects who didn't survive the procedures. As I compiled this information, I realized that I had uncovered something far more significant than a historical atrocity or a government cover-up. This was an ongoing crime against humanity, being committed by the American government using American taxpayer funding, with victims who were American citizens. The program that had started with Eric Traub's Nazi biological weapons research had evolved into a systematic effort to create a new form of human life, beings that combined human intelligence with enhanced physical capabilities derived from animal genetics, and according to all available evidence, it was accelerating. By November 2023, I knew that Plum Island would soon be sealed permanently, its secrets buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and official denial. The facility had been officially closed for months, but final decontamination procedures were still ongoing. Once those were complete, the island would be turned over to other agencies and eventually made accessible to researchers and environmental groups who would never be allowed to see the areas where the real work had been conducted. If I was going to find physical evidence of what had really happened there, if I was going to document the truth before it was destroyed forever, this was my last chance. I had been documenting everything I could find through official channels, satellite imagery, shipping records, personnel transfers, budget allocations, but I needed something more concrete. The files from the flash drive were compelling, but they could be dismissed as elaborate forgeries by anyone who didn't want to believe them. I needed photographs, video footage, physical evidence that couldn't be explained away. Finding someone willing to take me to Plum Island proved more difficult than I had expected. The island was still under military security despite the official closure, with Coast Guard patrols maintaining a security perimeter that extended several miles offshore. Most local boat operators refused to get anywhere near the area, citing concerns about federal penalties and the loss of their commercial fishing licenses. But money, as always, provided solutions. I eventually found Murphy, a weathered fishing boat captain in his 60s who had been working the waters around eastern Long Island for over 40 years. Murphy's boat, the Second Chance, was a sturdy 30-foot lobster boat that had seen better days but was still seaworthy, and more importantly fast enough to outrun Coast Guard patrol vessels if necessary. Murphy was initially reluctant to take me anywhere near Plum Island. "That place has always been bad news," he told me, as we negotiated terms at a dockside bar in Orient Point. "Even before the government took it over, the old-timers used to avoid it. My grandfather used to fish these waters, and he told me there was something wrong with that island. Said the fish around there tasted funny, and the seabirds that roosted there acted strange." But Murphy was also a practical man who understood the value of cash payments and the importance of discretion. For $2,000, paid in advance, he agreed to get me close enough to wade ashore with the understanding that if anything went wrong, if Coast Guard vessels appeared, or if I wasn't back by sunset, he would leave without me. We departed Orient Point at dawn on a grey November morning when fog provided natural cover for our approach. The water was choppy and cold, typical for late autumn in the North Atlantic, but Murphy navigated with the confidence of someone who had been working these waters longer than I had been alive. As we approached Plum Island, I could see why it had been chosen for classified research. The island was smaller than I had expected, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide, but it was completely isolated from the mainland and any casual observation. The research facilities were concentrated on the western end of the island, a complex of low concrete buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Most of the structures appeared to have been abandoned hastily. Doors stood open, windows were broken, and scientific equipment lay scattered across loading docks, as if the final evacuation had been conducted under emergency conditions. But as Murphy positioned his boat near a small beach on the island's eastern shore, I could see that not everything had been removed. "You've got 2 hours, Murphy told me as I prepared to wade ashore. "Any longer than that and we risk getting caught by the afternoon patrol. And if those Coast Guard boats show up, I'm leaving with or without you." The beach was rocky and unwelcoming, covered with the kind of sharp stones and tangled seaweed that discouraged casual visitors, but it provided cover from the main facility, allowing me to approach the abandoned buildings without being easily observed from the water. As I made my way across the island toward the research complex, I began to notice details that hadn't been visible from the boat. The vegetation was wrong, stunted and discoloured in ways that suggested contamination or chemical treatment. There were dead birds scattered throughout the underbrush, far more than would be natural for a small island ecosystem. Most disturbing of all, there were trails through the vegetation that looked like they had been made by something much larger than the rabbits, and small mammals that supposedly inhabited the island. These paths were wide enough for a human to walk through, but they showed signs of passage by creatures that moved differently. Deeper impressions where something heavy had stepped, scratch marks on trees at heights that suggested unusual proportions. The research facilities were more extensive than the satellite imagery had suggested. What appeared from above to be a few scattered buildings was actually a complex of interconnected structures, many of them partially underground. As I explored the remains of the main laboratory building, I found evidence of hasty abandonment, research notes scattered on floors, computer equipment that had been destroyed rather than relocated, and disposal areas where sensitive materials had been burned. But it was in the basement levels that I found what I was looking for. A staircase descended below ground level, ending at a heavy steel door that stood slightly ajar. Beyond the door was a tunnel that sloped downward into darkness, disappearing beneath the island's rocky foundation. This had to be the entrance to what Silas had called the room below the waterline, the submerged laboratory where the most extreme experiments had been conducted. The tunnel was longer than I had expected, descending at a steep angle for what must have been several hundred feet. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, but many of the systems appeared to have been hastily disconnected during the facility's closure. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as I made my way deeper underground, following a path that took me well below sea level. The tunnel ended at another steel door, this one standing wide open. Beyond it was a chamber that took my breath away, not from wonder, but from horror. The room was enormous, carved directly out of the bedrock beneath the island. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above my head, and the chamber extended far beyond what my flashlight could illuminate. Along the walls were dozens of glass-fronted holding cells, each large enough to contain a human being. Most of the cells were empty, their glass panels cracked or completely shattered, but a few still contained evidence of what had been held there. In one cell, I found restraint equipment that had been torn apart with tremendous force, the metal twisted and bent in ways that suggested inhuman strength. Another cell contained what appeared to be surgical instruments, abandoned in the middle of some procedure and left to rust in the underground dampness. But it was in the centre of the chamber that I found the most disturbing evidence. A series of examination tables, similar to what I had seen in the video files, were arranged around a central monitoring station. The tables were equipped with restraint systems that could accommodate subjects of various sizes, and the monitoring equipment suggested that procedures had been conducted on conscious subjects. Scattered around these tables were documents that had been left behind during the evacuation, medical charts, procedure notes, and photographs that provided a horrifying record of what had taken place in this underground chamber. The subjects documented in these files showed various stages of genetic modification, from early procedures that produced relatively minor changes to advanced transformations that had created beings that were barely recognizable as human. One photograph showed a subject who had been modified with genetic material from various predatory animals. The individual still retained human facial features, but their body had been elongated and their limbs extended to accommodate additional muscle mass and enhanced joint flexibility. According to the accompanying notes, this subject had demonstrated remarkable improvements in speed, strength, and sensory perception, but had also shown increasing aggression and resistance to containment protocols. Another file documented what appeared to be a more recent subject. The photographs were dated just months before the facility's closure. This individual had undergone procedures that incorporated genetic material from marine mammals, developing enhanced lung capacity and modified cardiovascular systems that allowed for extended underwater operation. The notes indicated that this subject had been designed for aquatic infiltration missions, but had proven psychologically unsuitable for operational deployment. As I documented the scene with my camera, taking photographs of every file and piece of evidence I could find, a sound began to emanate from somewhere deep in the facility. It was a low-frequency hum, barely audible but felt more than heard, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. The sound made my teeth ache and filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. I'd been underground for over an hour, longer than I had intended. But the evidence I was finding was too important to ignore. This chamber represented proof of everything I had been investigating. Physical evidence that human beings had been subjected to genetic modification procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. But as the humming sound grew louder, I began to realise that the facility might not be as abandoned as it appeared. The sound had a rhythmic quality that suggested machinery in operation, systems that were still functioning despite the official closure of the facility. I was preparing to leave when I heard something else, a shuffling sound from the shadows at the far end of the chamber. At first, I thought it might be rats or other small animals that had taken refuge in the abandoned facility. But the sound was too large, too deliberate to be made by anything that should have been living in these tunnels. I froze, holding my breath and listening carefully. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded almost like laboured breathing. Something was moving in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam, something that was aware of my presence and was approaching cautiously. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, and in that moment I understood why the government had gone to such extraordinary lengths to keep this place secret, why they had been willing to commit murder to protect these secrets. Something stepped out of the shadows, something that had once been human but was no longer entirely so. The creature moved with a strange, loping gait, its elongated limbs carrying it forward with an unsettling grace. Its body showed clear evidence of surgical modification, scars that covered every inch of exposed skin, joints that bent in directions they shouldn't, and proportions that suggested extensive genetic alteration. But it was when the creature looked directly at me that I felt my sanity begin to fracture. Its eyes were unmistakably human, intelligent, aware, and filled with an emotion that I can only describe as desperate hope. This thing had once been a person, someone with thoughts and feelings and a life outside this underground hell. And somehow it had survived the facility's closure, hiding in the tunnels and chambers beneath Plum Island, forgotten by the researchers who had created it. The creature tried to speak, making sounds that might once have been words, but its vocal cords had been so severely modified that human speech was impossible. Instead, it began making gestures, trying to communicate through hand signals that retained some vestige of human language. I realised it was trying to tell me something, trying to convey information that it considered important. It kept pointing toward the deeper parts of the facility, making urgent gestures that suggested there was something else I needed to see, something that was even more significant than the evidence I'd already discovered. But I had been underground too long already, and the approaching deadline for my return to Murphy's boat left no time for further exploration. As much as I wanted to document everything this creature might show me, I knew that missing my extraction would mean being stranded on Plum Island when security patrols resumed their normal schedules. I took several photographs of the creature, trying to document its appearance and the clear evidence of genetic modification, but I could see the disappointment in its eyes as I backed toward the tunnel entrance. It understood that I was leaving, that its one chance to communicate with the outside world was slipping away. As I retreated through the underground tunnels, I could hear the creature following me at a distance, making sounds that might have been attempts to call me back. But I didn't dare delay any longer. Murphy had been clear that he wouldn't wait past the agreed departure time, and being discovered by security forces would mean the end of my investigation, and possibly my life. I emerged from the underground facility just as the afternoon fog was beginning to lift, providing less cover for my return to the beach. Murphy was waiting exactly where he had promised, his boat positioned for a quick departure, but I could see the tension in his posture as he scanned the horizon for patrol vessels. "We need to go now," he said as I waded out to the boat. "I've been monitoring the radio frequencies and there's increased Coast Guard activity in the area. Someone may have spotted us approaching the island." As we departed Plum Island, heading back toward the safety of Long Island's north shore, I looked back at the abandoned facility and thought about the creature I had left behind. How many others like it were hiding in those underground chambers? How many subjects had been abandoned when the facility closed, left to survive as best they could in the tunnels beneath the island? The photographs and documents I had obtained provided conclusive proof that the Plum Island facility had been conducting illegal human experimentation for decades. But they also raised questions that I wasn't sure I was prepared to answer. If some subjects had survived the facility's closure, What would happen to them now? And what would happen to me when the people responsible for these atrocities learned that their secrets were no longer safe? I'm recording this message from a motel room in Junction City, Kansas, less than 30 miles from the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility. I arrived here 3 days ago, following leads that suggested the Plum Island program had not only continued after the facility's closure, but had expanded dramatically at its new location. What I found here exceeded my worst fears about what our government is capable of. The NBAF facility is massive, a sprawling complex of laboratories and containment units that makes Plum Island look like a small research outpost. From the outside, it appears to be exactly what the government claims, a state-of-the-art agricultural research centre designed to protect American food systems from biological threats. But what's happening beneath the facility is something else entirely. I managed to obtain construction documents that show underground levels extending deep into the Kansas bedrock, chambers and laboratories that don't appear on any public blueprints. These subterranean facilities are larger and more sophisticated than anything that existed at Plum Island, designed to accommodate research on a scale that was impossible at the island location. More disturbing still are the transportation records I discovered, showing regular shipments of what are classified as biological research materials arriving from locations across the country. The frequency and volume of these shipments suggest that the Kansas facility is receiving far more test subjects than could be explained by voluntary recruitment. Cross-referencing these shipping dates with missing person reports from nearby cities, I found evidence of what appears to be an organised abduction program. Young adults who match the demographic profile of ideal research subjects, military veterans, athletes, individuals with exceptional physical capabilities, are disappearing at rates that far exceed statistical norms in areas surrounding the facility. The disappearances are carefully managed to avoid attracting attention. Subjects are taken from different cities, at different times, with different circumstances, making it impossible for law enforcement to recognise the pattern. But when viewed collectively, they represent evidence of a systematic program to provide test subjects for genetic modification experiments. I attempted to get closer to the facility itself, but the security measures here far exceed anything that existed at Plum Island. The entire complex is surrounded by multiple layers of fencing, electronic surveillance systems, and armed patrols that operate around the clock. Overhead surveillance suggests that the facility is protected by military-grade air defense systems that could detect and intercept any unauthorized aircraft. But I didn't need to get inside to understand what was happening there. The evidence I had already collected, combined with what I discovered in Kansas, painted a clear picture of a program that had evolved from Nazi biological weapons research into something far more ambitious and terrifying. The goal is no longer simply to create enhanced soldiers or biological weapons. According to documents I obtained through sources I cannot identify without putting them at risk, the current research is focused on what scientists call directed human evolution, the systematic genetic modification of human beings to create new forms of intelligent life. The researchers believe they are on the verge of a breakthrough that will allow them to create beings that combine human cognitive abilities with enhanced physical characteristics derived from various animal species. These new life forms would possess intelligence and problem-solving capabilities superior to normal humans, while also having enhanced strength, speed, sensory perception, and disease resistance. But the research requires extensive testing on human subjects, and the failure rate is extraordinarily high. According to internal documents I found, less than 10% of subjects survive the genetic modification procedures with their cognitive abilities intact. The rest either die during the transformation process or suffer psychological damage that makes them unsuitable for operational use. This means that for every successful subject, at least 9 others must be sacrificed. And based on the scale of operation suggested by the transportation records and facility specifications, they are processing hundreds of subjects annually. Last night I made the mistake of trying to get too close to the facility. I was discovered by security patrols while attempting to photograph the underground ventilation systems, and barely managed to escape to my car before they could apprehend me. But I know they got a clear look at me, and they probably have my license plate number. This morning I woke to find my motel room door standing open. Nothing was missing, nothing was obviously disturbed, But the message was clear. They know where I am, and they know what I've been investigating. The fact that they let me wake up suggests they want me to know I'm being watched, that I should abandon this investigation before they decide I'm too dangerous to leave alive. But I can't stop now. The evidence I've gathered represents proof of the most extensive violation of human rights in American history. This isn't just about government secrecy or illegal medical experiments. This is about the systematic torture and murder of American citizens in pursuit of creating a new form of human life. The program that began with Eric Traub's Nazi biological weapons research has evolved into something that would have impressed even the most ambitious Nazi scientists. Using modern genetic engineering techniques, American researchers are doing things that the Nazis could only dream of, creating hybrid beings that combine human intelligence with animal capabilities, producing living weapons that could change the nature of warfare and human society. And they're doing it with American funding on American soil, using American citizens as test subjects. I've distributed copies of all the files to trusted contacts with instructions to release them if something happens to me. The flash drive that started this investigation contained only a fraction of what I've discovered. The complete files include thousands of documents, hours of video footage, and photographs that provide incontrovertible proof of ongoing crimes against humanity. The American people deserve to know what their government has been doing in their name. They deserve to know that their tax dollars have been funding Nazi-style medical experiments for over 70 years. They deserve to know that young Americans are being kidnapped, tortured, and murdered to advance research that violates every principle of human decency.